Hello, Toronto. What's up, guys? Man, it's great to be here with you. What an amazing, what a welcoming, what a thriving city. Somebody told me recently it's actually considered one of the most diverse cities in the world, which I think is something to be proud of, man. Like, people coming together, people converging, people getting along. I mean, it's really, really inspiring to be here. I think we could use a little bit of that inclusion back in the U.S. at the moment. So, yeah. Honestly, it's a thrill to be here with you guys. My whole experience in Canada so far, Vancouver was magnificent, Kelowna was amazing, and it's great to be here with you guys now. So, yeah, I'm Jason. Nice to meet you guys. And I hosted a show called Brain Games on the National Geographic Channel for a couple of years, and that show was all about our perceptions and our misperceptions of reality. And as it turns out, reality is coupled to perception. As Joseph Campbell used to say, reality is just a word, and a word that you shouldn't use without quotation marks around it. And what I mean by that is that often the lenses through which we see the world cloud our perception of the world, right? We see with our lenses, we see through our lenses, but we often don't see the lenses themselves. And I think a lot of the afflictions of anxiety and depression that we're seeing today, these epidemic levels of existential angst, have a lot to do with the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. A friend of mine who has a YouTube channel called The Nerd Writer, who I admire very much, was once asked about the nature of a personal crisis. And he said, basically, a personal crisis begins when the story you tell yourself about yourself is no longer convincing. Because we live inside our stories. We are autobiographical beings. We have this running narrative, and this story provides the maps of meaning that govern our lives. These stories tell us what to do and how to do it. You've probably read Joseph Campbell's work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which deconstructs how all mythologies, all stories, all effective, cathartic, transformative stories across time share the same patterns, share the same motif. They all involve answering the call. They all involve experiencing a little bit of a fire in that belly, right? Some discomfort, some angst that pulls you towards the unknown, that pulls you towards an adventure, that pulls you towards your fears, that pulls you towards the dragon, right? You know, the cave you fear holds the treasure you seek, right? Everything you want is on the other side of fear. I mean, we've all read the bumper stickers, we've all heard it 1,000 times, but there is a lot of truth to these mythologies. There is a lot of truth to these patterns, to these maps of meaning, and I think we can learn from applying those insights, from applying those patterns in our lives. As Isaiah Berlin famously said, to understand is to perceive patterns. To understand is to connect the dots. But you also, my friends, have to at least subjectively connect the dots in a way that serves you, right? Somebody today at lunch was talking to me about the fact that their favorite word is pronoia. Now, pronoia is the antidote to paranoia. So if you're connecting the dots in a way that makes it seem like the world is against you, you're being paranoid. If you're connecting the dots in a way that tells you the world is serving you, then you're pronoid instead of paranoid. I thought that was a great phrase. But again, where does this start for me? I grew up in South America. I grew up in Venezuela. And, oh yeah, a couple of Venezuelans in the audience. That's nice. I was lucky. I grew up in a bilingual, multicultural environment. I studied at an American school, and my household was one that was largely secular, but emphasized kindness and creativity. My mother always said that the way in which you deal with your angst, your pain, your grief, your sorrow, your frustration is through artistic creativity, through expressing your creativity. And so I guess it was inevitable for me to eventually fall in love with the video camera because it provided a means to artfully capture and or articulate angst and turn it into an active work project. The psychologist Ernest Becker, who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Denial of Death, which is a marvelous book that I recommend to everybody, he says that the difference between the neurotic and the artist is precisely the fact that the neurotic cannot create. And so he chokes on his introversions. See, both of them are highly sensitive. Both of them are acutely aware of the human condition. They both bite off more than they can chew. They both take in the world with remarkable intensity. But the neurotic is overwhelmed by that intensity and, again, lives inside of these cul-de-sacs and error messages and self-doubt and crippling self-loathing and all that jazz, eventually having probably to medicate himself to get through it. The artist feels the same angst, but turns it into an active work project. So what is the solution? What is one of the most effective responses to the human conundrum is to figure out something creative that you can do with that fire in your belly, right? Find out something creative that you can do with that existential angst. And by the way, when stripped of all these stories, what is this existential angst? Well, I think it was summarized most effectively in a documentary called Flight from Death about the ideas of Ernest Becker. And the documentary begins with the following narration. He says, "To have emerged from nothing," right? Because we literally emerged from nothing. "To have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feeling, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression. And with all this, yet to die," right? Human beings, we find ourselves uniquely in quite the predicament because we have the mental capacity to ponder the infinite, right? Seemingly capable of anything. Yet we're housed in these heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies. So we're simultaneously gods and worms. It's fucked up. This Professor Sheldon Solomon, who studies terror management theory, the ways in which we respond to the anxiety of being mortal beings, says it even more crudely. The explicit awareness that you're a breathing piece of defecating meat destined to die and ultimately no more significant than a lizard or a potato is not especially uplifting. This is the human conundrum, right? Back when Sigmund Freud's ideas about neurosis were really popular, everything could be reduced down to sexual repression, right? We were hysterical and anxious and nervous and neurotic because we weren't getting off in bed, right? That was, in a nutshell, Freud. But Ernest Becker, I think, is even more interesting and more broad. He says, yeah, that's one aspect of it. But the source of our faint disquiet, the source of our existential malaise, is ultimately the unbearable awareness of being mortal and knowing it. See, we're the only species that can contemplate its own mortality. Other animals respond to a threat, but as soon as the threat is not there anymore, they go back into the blissful now. Whereas we tend to lose sleep over the fact that one day, a decade from now, a century, maybe half a century, 25 years from now, we'll get old, we'll wither away, and we will die, right? And so that anxiety is something we have to do something with. In fact, this guy goes as far as saying that the entire human character structure, the whole identity symbolic system that we've come up with, right? Our sense of self, the social constructs that we invest ourselves in, the mythological motifs that provide maps and meaning for our lives, these virtual realities, these cultural operating systems, right, are necessary illusions. In other words, they are necessary fictions. They are fictions that are required for our mental health. That without these constructs, the only response to the human condition is full and open psychosis. Ernest Becker says schizophrenics are suffering from the truth. But here's the thing. The dream is real when you're in it. These virtual realities are rendered real the minute that we suspend disbelief and invest ourselves in them. In other words, these maps of meaning only require consensus and commitment to become real. It's only when there's cracks in our maps of meaning that the problems arise. And so the beginning of a personal crisis then becomes a chance to tell a better fucking story that serves not just us, but our fellow humans, right? If there's one thing that we can do with our lives to render it significant in the face of death, right? Carl Sagan's mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, which is what Earth ultimately can be reduced to from the vantage point of space, then how can we craft narratives and stories, right? Maps of meaning that direct our lives in ways that can serve our common humanity with empathy, compassion, and love. There should be nothing else, right? Now, Ernest Becker, well, you guys are sweet. Ernest Becker has mapped responses to the human conundrum throughout history. Now, the initial solution was religion in its conventional form, a social technology that provided these sort of comforting, blanketing stories, these maps of meaning. Don't worry if you're a good person, if you have a moral compass, if you help thy neighbor, etc., 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 you'll live forever in the kingdom of God. Death will not rob you of your glory, right? Great story. I'm envious in a loving way of those that are faithful. But it doesn't do it for me. I ask too many questions. I look for too much evidence, and in the end, doesn't do it for me. Plus, when applied by human beings, we tend to corrupt and distort and misinterpret the elegant allegories of religion, the beautiful metaphors and life lessons by taking them literally, and before we know it, using them as means of social control, opium of the masses, etc. So we know that we do a piss-poor job of applying a lot of the insights from religion. The other way that we've responded to our situation in the past is through the romantic solution to the problem of death. The romantic solution to the problem of death, that's a fun one to dive into from time to time. That's when we deify our friends and lovers, mostly our lovers. She's like the wind. She's my salvation. She is the song of songs. When I look into the iris of a lover's eye, I am having my way with something larger and grander than myself. By rubbing up against perfection itself, we are absolved of our mortality, and we feel and or become infinite. It feels great. But no relationship can bear the burden of godhood. No, our gods will eventually reveal their clay feet. And then once we see these cracks, those cracks are like mirrors, broken mirrors, that reveal our own flaws and cracks and fears back to us. We then deflate the love object and find ourselves back in our own nodding resignation. So love's tough. I'm all about it. I'm a total romantic. I've fallen in and out of love a million times. But in the end, it's probably the third solution to the problem of death that is the most effective one. And that's the one that I was talking about before, to give ourselves to something grander and larger, to come up with a story, to come up with a creative response to the human condition, a creative project that we can use to impregnate our lives with meaning and signification. This is ultimately what it's all about, right? And so I ask you, right, every single day, I would ask you to ask yourself that question. What is my story? What can I do to leave a footprint, to carve my name on the tree and say I was here, I felt something, and I matter? How will you affirm your own existence, your agency, your creative vitality in a way that serves not just you, but others? And by the way, it feels really fucking good to help other people. It's called the helper's high. Neurochemically, you get rewarded for serving others. Altruism, compassion, and empathy gets us off So on top of everything, like it seems like we're designed to be kind to one another. It's got to be a sign that we're on the right path. And when you look at all the ways in which this creativity has manifested itself, right? As Terence McKenna says, human beings are like coral reef-like animal that extrudes technological material. Our creativity has become manifest in the world in the form of our tools and technologies. What is the man-made, the human-made world, if not the condensation of human imagination? What is the man-made world if not our creativity, imagination, and vitality turned inside out? Our smartphones are extensions of our mind. Technology is a scaffolding that extends our thought, our reach, and our vision. Not only that, but these tools and technologies have been advancing exponentially, right? We've exceeded our own intuition because we continue to think that the challenges that we have before us are too difficult to surmount, that technology will cause more problems before it causes or creates the right solutions. But see, we have exceeded our own intuition. Technology is actually going faster than what our very intuition tells us. When you think about change, you think about it linearly. When you think about technological advancement, the creative enterprise of human beings, you think about it as a slow-moving linear train. But it's not. Technology changes exponentially. We've unleashed a kind of divine self-organizing engineering. If you take 30 linear steps, which is how we think about technological change, you get to 30. If you take 30 exponential steps, which is how technology changes over time, you go 2, 4, 16, by step 30, you're at 1 billion. And that's why the smartphone in your pocket today is 1 million times cheaper, 1 million times smaller, 1,000 times more powerful than what used to be a $60 million supercomputer that was half a building in size 40 years ago. In 40 years, a supercomputer was half a building. Now it fits in your pocket. And the one in your pocket's 1,000 times more powerful. Why am I telling you this? Because a young kid in rural Africa with a smartphone has better communications technology than a head of state had 25 years ago. I'm telling you this because according to a 2010 United Nations study cited by Bill Clinton in a Time magazine cover story, the cell phone was the greatest invention in history to pull people out of poverty. I'm telling you this because the tools to make our dreams come true, the tools to change the world, the tools to change ourselves are now in everybody's hands. And as Marshall McLuhan, the media philosopher, used to say, we build the tools, but then the fucking tools build us. That means we extend our capabilities, we redefine our boundaries, we transcend our limits. We become something more than what we were. And this creativity, this fire in the belly that has engendered itself in the form of marvelous jetliners and computers and information technologies, our capacity to take in material of low organization, put it through the filters of the mind, and extrude space shuttles and iPhones, this capacity has now spilled over into our very biological being. Genetics and biotechnology is now allowing us to reprogram our DNA. Because it turns out we are made of language, we are linguistic, we are alphabetic all the way down. DNA is code, and code that we can increasingly manipulate. We are now directing our own evolution. We have the capacity to reprogram our genes, to turn off genes that cause cancer, to turn on genes that promote longevity, to alleviate suffering, to cure illness is all within our grasp. And you know what else is within our grasp? Human mortality itself. Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, recently started Calico, the California Life Extension Company, a software company for biology. Time magazine cover story said, Google and the end of death. Silicon Valley's next frontier, disease and aging. Turns out human creativity has finally exceeded its own biological limitations, and we are on the cusp of engendering our own godhood. Having invented the gods, said Alan Harrington, now we can turn into them. Stuart Brand said, we are as gods and might as well get good at it. Craig Venter, who created the first synthetic organism, was asked by the media, do you worry that you're playing God? You know what he said? Who's playing? So this all may start with a nodding resignation, with a feeling of hopeless and helpless gnawing in the belly. But it leads us towards a teleological directionality, a move towards greater complexity, creativity, and organization. The technology of the oil painting was a necessary prerequisite, according to Kevin Kelly, for the marvelous creative expression of Van Gogh. The technology of the musical instrument was a necessary prerequisite for the genius of Mozart and Beethoven to emerge through that. What new technologies, what new forms of creativity will we embody, will we manifest in the world that will act then as a conduit to new forms of human rapture, radiance, and beauty? I mean, we have within us the capacity to be paradise engineers. Advances in genetics, as I've mentioned, artificial intelligence, which continues to advance exponentially. Nanotechnology will allow us to make things, buildings that assemble themselves, structures that self-amend. I mean, look, we're on the cusp of an event horizon. Some call it the singularity. But perhaps, perhaps it is this event horizon that beckons. Perhaps the reason for the fire in our belly, perhaps the existential angst that afflicts so many of us is a brilliant glitch in natural selection that has made us do what we've done and continue to achieve. Maybe this was part of the plan all along. I don't know. But what I do know is that it's time to seize the day. We have the tools, we have the capacity, we have the creative vitality to overcome any and all limitations, but we must do it together. We must come up with consensus, and we must figure out a way to thwart the dummies, the fear-mongerers, the weaponized mimetics, and the filter bubbles, and the self-reinforcing algorithms that force us into staying in our cognitive biases and slippages on social media, or the doom and gloom messaging of the media enterprise. We must look beyond. The point being, we're all on this journey together. We're all on this search together. And in the words of Walker Percy, the search is what anyone would undertake if they were not sunk in the everydayness of their own lives. To become aware of the possibility of the search is to be on to something. Not to be onto something is to be in despair. And as David Foster Wallace wrote, the alternative to seizing that call, the alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing.